What is something you did in your youth that, if you turned out to be a mentally ill psychopath serial killer, people would look back and say I should have seen it then? When I was around 12 or 13, my favorite pet rabbit died. We had quite a few. And somehow, in her death throes, she had managed to wrap her teeth around 2 links in the bottom of her cage. So now rigor mortis has set in, and she's completely stuck with her teeth set around the bottom of the cage. I try to pull her off, but no luck, so I go back into the house and tell my mom that Cinnamon Buns is dead, and I need a screwdriver. As my mom cries in the kitchen, I head back out to the barn with my screwdriver to jimmy her mouth open enough to get her off the bottom of the cage. The whole time, all I'm thinking is what if I use too much force and her head rips in half? It didn't, but I think my mom was genuinely concerned about the fact that I felt zero emotion about the whole thing. I just put the corpse in a bag and told her I'd deal with it when I got home from school. Washed my hands, had breakfast, and went on about my day. Rip Cinnamon Buns. Glad your head didn't rip in half. In 3rd grade, every day the teacher would start a sentence to a story, and we had 30 minutes to make up whatever we wanted after. Almost all of my stories involved something messed up, with one death usually happening. Some examples include the puppy fell under, and I proceeded to write a story about a puppy that fell into a bottomless pit, all of its probable thoughts, and said it fell so long it eventually died while still falling. Those were some awkward parent-teacher conferences, I'm sure. Have you ever seen those weird tube-like things that look, let's be honest, like male masturbatory aids, but that are really just toys? I can't for the life of me remember what they're called, but they were a favorite of mine as a kid. Unfortunately, they never lasted very long, as I had a tendency to accidentally puncture them within minutes of being gifted one. The water inside would leak out, the toy would become a floppy mess of plastic, and I'd go back to doing whatever I'd been doing before I'd been given the ill-advised present. One day, though, something a little bit different happened. As had happened countless times before, I'd been given one of those tube toys. In an effort to keep it from slipping from my 5-year-old hands, I took to gripping it as hard as I possibly could. Naturally, this caused it to slip from my hands, and also to go flying across my back patio, eventually landing with a sickening smack. I ran over to retrieve my toy, which had developed a hole, of course, and as I lifted it from the bricks, I saw something curious. By a stroke of insane luck, the plastic tube had landed on a pair of boxelder bugs, which were a common sight in that area. Less lucky, for the bugs, at least, was that they had been crushed on impact, leaving a sticky red mess on my toy. Now, I don't know exactly where I got this idea, but upon seeing the insects innards, I came to the conclusion that I'd discovered an alternative means of making ketchup. After a brief trip inside to get a small bowl and a plastic spoon, both of which I believe had originally been a part of my kitchen playset, I set about collecting as many boxelder bugs as I could find and mashing them into a vaguely red pulp. Several minutes went by, with my supply of ketchup growing slowly but steadily. I probably would have kept at it had my mother not come to check on why I'd stopped shrieking about the ruptured plastic tube. "Maximum," she said, eyeing my bowl of crushed bugs. "What are you doing?" "Making ketchup," I cheerfully replied. Just then, I spotted another boxelder bug, which I quickly grabbed and dropped into my bowl. My mother kept silent as I crushed the insect into the goop that remained of its cousins. "Are you going to eat that?" she finally asked, perhaps more calmly than most would expect. "Yes," I declared. "I'm going to put it on a hot dog and eat it." "We don't have any hot dogs," answered my mother. "Why don't you just take a taste right now?" Let me tell you, I was absolutely overjoyed that my mother was supporting my efforts. With a big grin on my face, I scooped up a bit of my newly made ketchup, slipped it into my mouth, and much, I screamed, coughing and spitting. "That's bad ketchup. Bad ketchup." My mother nodded, looking a bit more satisfied than perhaps she should have. "Go wash out your toys, and don't crush up any more bugs." I sullenly followed her orders, feeling intensely disappointed that I'd wasted so much time with my ultimately fruitless endeavor. At least, I reasoned, I could still get some enjoyment out of that punctured toy tube that I'd left outside. Unfortunately, by the time I returned, it had already deflated on its own. The anger and disappointment that I felt made me want to kill something. But my mother had said that I couldn't do that anymore. TL. Doctor, accidental toy mutilation leads to me torturing and killing dozens in pursuit of bad ketchup. Well, I suppose I may as well confess this. I'm a killer. My first murder, and I do think of it as such now, after all the therapy I've had, and self-analysis that I've done, was an accident. Though I've tried to rationalize it by claiming that I just wasn't careful enough, or that I wasn't paying attention, the simple truth of the matter is that there was an element of intent to my actions. I was curious about how it would feel, about what would happen. Like those times when you stand at the edge of a cliff and think, just for a moment, what it would be like to jump. The only difference was that my life wasn't at risk, but that of another being. I can still remember the wet, sickening crunch. The feeling haunted me for a while after that. But perhaps more disturbing was the sense of satisfied, empowered superiority that I experienced. I knew that killing was wrong, but in a strange way, I didn't care. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that knowing it was such a horrific act made it all the more appealing. I didn't have any plans to repeat it, but I wanted to. Just under a month later, I killed again. Put yourself in my shoes. Imagine seeing a lone innocent walking along the street at night. You might very well have missed them, were it not for the glow of the street lamp and the dancing shadow of their movement. You glance around and see that other than them, you're completely alone. If you wanted to, you could end their life. You could be the final thing that they saw before the light in their eyes dimmed forever. You could be the only one to ever claim that you killed them. It would make you special. It would make you the equivalent of a god. Sometimes I wonder if my second victim even knew that I was coming. That was all it took. I gave myself over entirely to those murderous urges. I killed again and again, all the while convincing myself that I was somehow ridding the world of filth. Each time, it was an act of opportunity, a crime of passion executed by the cold, unfeeling entity that I became in those moments. To date, I've likely had dozens, if not hundreds of victims. And though I've learned to feel remorse for my actions, the motivation for those killings is still with me. I really hate spiders. I had a bully in 4th grade and he would not let up. One day he took my drawing and tore it up in half, so I chased him down the hall with a pencil, threatening to stab him with it. I tackled him down and had my arm drawn back when they pulled me off of him. I turned out perfectly fine, I'd say. My bully went to prison about 7 years ago for car theft and aggravated assault. Also can be noted that Aaron Hernandez was also in our class, and we all know how that turned out. When I was a kid I used to pour hot wax from candles onto my hands. It hurt like hell, but I thought it was worth it to have cool wax shapes with my fingerprints in them. Definite serial killer material. In about 2nd grade I started watching scary movies and loved them. In my notebook I would draw characters and scenes from these scary movies. One day my teacher had a notebook check and was worried about my drawings, so she spoke to my mom and me about it. I didn't really understand at the time. I remember I was upset that she didn't like my drawings. Well, my mom wrote this story down when I was little, and I'm glad she did, because I don't remember it. Apparently, at the age of 3, I had an imaginary friend named Thompson. One day, sadly, Thompson died. My mom asked me what happened to him, and I told her that he had eaten too many calories and therefore died. I then informed her that I was going to hold a funeral for him and make him a get well card. When I was 5, I read an article in Parents magazine about common household toxins, which, by the way, I haven't been able to find ever since. If the power of the internet can find that article from about 1992ish, I would be very gratefully amused. The substances discussed in the article were carbon monoxide, lead, radon, asbestos, and formaldehyde. I must have read that article 10 times. I was fascinated by the first 2 in particular, but the others were cool too, I guess. I wrote a little song about carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is very, very deadly. I never said 5-year-old me was a lyrical genius or anything. Apparently, advanced reading skills don't guarantee advanced writing songs about lethal poison skills. Later, when I was 8, I had to do a research project in school on a topic of my choice. I wrote a disturbingly detailed 6-page paper on those particular 5 poisonous substances. Also when I was 8, I had these stuffed animals called Puppy Surprise and Kitty Surprise. There was a mother with a velcro stomach, and each mother had 3 tiny baby stuffed animals in it. Adorable, of course. I named my mother Catfall. Her kittens were Down, the, and Scares. The mother dog then got the name Anne, with puppies named Kill, Your, and Self. I repeat. 8-year-old me had stuffed animals named Fall, Down, the, Scares, and Kill, Your, and Self. I remember a lot of giggling about those names, so I'm pretty sure I knew how fucked up it was. When I was 9, my favorite game was one I played by myself. Shocking, I know, that the creepy weirdo girl didn't have friends. I would pretend that I was being held captive by an evil Scandinavian man named Lankina, who locked me in his dungeon and forced me to knit scarves for his gnomes. He had a wife, Helga, who was kind of like my imaginary friend. She would sit with me while I was knitting and cower in fear when Lankina came to whip his slaves for knitting too slowly. The only part of the game that was real was the knitting. As far as my parents could tell, I was just sitting on the back porch knitting for hours with absolutely no savage beatings or slavery involved whatsoever. I just made that stuff up to keep the afternoons interesting. When I was 11, I had this toy that was a bunch of colorful erasers inside a plastic tube. I used to sit in class and hit myself in the knee with it over and over. Eventually my teacher asked me what on earth I was doing. I remember being surprised that she asked, and I just calmly looked up at her and said matter-of-factly, "Oh, I'm giving myself a bruise." Apparently, doing weird shit was kind of par for the course for me. It got less funny and more get this girl to therapy now as I got a little older, but now things have leveled out, and it's funny again. And my sense of humor is still kind of off. Probably flooding ants out of their ant holes and then lighting them on fire with a barbecue lighter. Either that or killing a squirrel by waiting for it to come below my deck and crushing its head with a large rock. Yeah, looking back I was a pretty fucked up child. When I was 13 or 14 and first started playing The Sims, I made a serial killer. He would put his victims in a 4x1 cell with a fridge, enough to keep them alive but no more. He would sit and watch them in misery for hours and get off to it. He fell in love with a woman who scorned him. She ended up there as well. Most of the neighborhood ended up buried in his backyard. So if I ended up as a serial killer, I don't think people would be even remotely surprised. I set fire to the living room curtains when I was 7. And I set fire to an old chair in an old outbuilding when I was 8. And maybe something else when I was 13 that I'm not telling you about because I don't know what the statute of limitations is in my area for arson. Don't worry, no one was hurt. But, after that particular incident, which is not an admission of guilt, thank you very much, I kinda gave up the whole firebug thing. Fire. 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 One time in the game Black and White, God Simulator game, I made everyone into an disciple breeder. And I started killing everyone in my village. There were very efficient ways to kill people, however I didn't use those. I simply tried to skip the villagers on the water, hour after hour, until everyone was dead. Which took a while, since people were doing everything they could to grow the conversation. I really liked throwing the children. Or throwing everyone in a family except for the father. Then wait for him to remarry, and have another 5 kids, then kill them all, and have him try again. My brother and I used to make paper airplanes, and have contests to see who could make one that flew the best, or went the furthest, or landed most correctly. There were also a lot of small lizards around where we lived. So we eventually devised a way to judge the landing of our planes by taping a lizard in the crease at the front of the plane with his head sticking out the front. Then we'd throw our plane, and if it landed correctly with a nose up attitude the lizard would come through relatively unscathed. However, if it landed virtually any other way the outcome for the lizard was usually much worse. I was pretty quick to get angry as a kid, but it was all at the stuff kids usually get angry at: video games, getting made fun of, little brother doing something to annoy me, My parents and older sisters used to tell me all the time that if I didn't learn to control my anger I would wind up killing somebody and going to prison. I remember thinking at the time that that was a horrible thing to say to a kid, and I still do. All the same, if I had turned into a serial killer I'm sure I would have heard them in the courtroom saying yup, I knew he would turn out like this, since the day he threw the Super Nintendo controller on the ground because he couldn't beat that one boss in Mario. I lit my mother's bed on fire while she was laying in it. My mom told me she'd take me to the arcade, but she wanted to finish watching a soap opera. I was just being a bored little kid looking for stuff to play with under her bed, and I found a lighter. The box spring was old and that paper/cloth material had rips in it that were hanging down in strands. I looked at the lighter and looked at the strand. You know on Looney Tunes how they light a piece of dynamite and the fuse goes out just before it explodes? That's what my young mind thought would happen, so I lit it. Immediately the fire spread in both directions towards the head and foot of the bed. Again I draw back on my Looney Tunes expertise and think I can just blow it out. Not a chance. In a matter of 10 seconds fire engulfed an outer ring of the bed. That's when my mom noticed it and jumped out screaming. We lived in my grandparents' basement at the time. My nana heard and came running down. In the heat of the moment and possibly thinking that liquid will put out a fire, my nana grabs a gallon of bleach to try to put out the blaze. That was probably a bad idea. They eventually got it under control, and my grandparents' house didn't burn down luckily. My father had a pair of sweat pants on the bed, which got bleach stains all over them, and he wears them to this day over 20 years later. I'm sure you're wondering. Yes, I did still get to go to the arcade and got my ass handed to me in Street Fighter.